Welcome everyone to 3 Count Commentaries. I am MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to try to make sense of Billy Jack Haynes, a man that is more mythology than history. And in a situation with this Billy Jack Haynes, it requires a lot of outside confirmation. There's not a lot that you can take seriously at face value in terms of things that he said. But I'm not going to go out here and just call everything a lie. Just going to say certain things I couldn't, individually on my own verify, which some other people may be able to figure it out. But what I did like about this episode is that Billy Jack Haynes himself was in it, and it was he looked like a tough old guy. Looked like he was still in pretty good shape, even though he's in his 70s now. But in the Dark Side of the Ring episode, while he sits in prison, he talked about only loving 2 people. One was his wife, whom he's accused of killing, and the second was his father, whom he had taken care of when his father fell ill. And his father went blind at 20 when Billy Jack Haynes was 22 years old, and he worked odd jobs to take care of him. This comes from the Willamette Week, which was September of 1988. It was an article. So he was taking care of his dad and working as a janitor, and he also worked as a bouncer at a nightclub called the Stone Pony. This was a nightclub that was frequented by Portland wrestlers. Billy Jack Haynes had grew up becoming a fan of Portland wrestling. He had grew up in the area, obviously. Dutch Savage and Rip Oliver, 2 guys who took pretty good liking to him, brought him in. He trained for about 4 months, and then it is said he was sent to Calgary to work with Stu Hart and train up there, but I haven't been able to independently verify that. The 2 years, of course, he spent in Portland, he was, booked from the beginning to be a huge star. And it was an interesting case because Billy Jack Haynes in the documentary, it stated how much of a bully he was and that he was a regular tough guy. And they even told some stories about, him slapping Percy Pringle, who some of you may know as Paul Bearer, the manager of The Undertaker in the WWF. And, being bullied to other people. But he had actually been to prison before. And he had been to prison for fighting. And he had been historically a bodybuilder and a weightlifter. So he was a pretty big guy, pretty tough guy too. So, pro wrestling seemed like it was a sort of a natural thing for him. After his initial success in Oregon, he goes down to Florida, where he eventually met his wife, Selena, one of his wives, because he was married multiple times. The lady he was accused of killing was actually like his 3rd or 4th wife. So Selena, he marries her in Florida. Then he goes to work for Jim Crockett Promotions. He leaves, claiming that Jim Crockett paid less than he was promised. He bounces back and forth between Oregon and then goes to the WWF, where obviously he wrestled at WrestleMania 3 in the Full Nelson Challenge against Hercules Hernandez. Of course, a lot of financial success came to his very short time in the WWF, and Selena opened up a gym back in Oregon called the Billy Jack Haynes Gym in Danielson Hilltop Mall at the time. While Billy Jack Haynes was in the WWF, not only did he get to wrestle at WrestleMania 3 against Hercules, but he also teamed up with Ken Patera. And they were a pretty successful tag team. They spent a lot of time wrestling Demolition. They wrestled the Hart Foundation. They wrestled the Dream Team, of course, of Dino Bravo and Greg the Hammer Valentine. They had a pretty good run. Of course, they never became the tag team champions, but a pretty lengthy run throughout 1987. The last match they would have would be a loss to Demolition in 1988, February of 1988. Ken Patera tells a pretty funny story in Dark Side of the Ring about the WWF wanted them to make them the Lumberjacks, complete with chainsaws, real chainsaws at that, which I thought was incredible. After being fired for the overdose, he decides to become a promoter, and he starts up the Oregon Wrestling Federation. Now, I do want to spend a little bit more time here than they did in Dark Side of the Ring, because it's pretty important that a lot of fans say that the boys should just, leave and start their own wrestling promotion. They act as if this stuff has never been tried before. And here is Billy Jack Haynes, a guy who hadn't even been in the business that long, who had a certain level of success, and star power in the area, decides he's going to run his own wrestling company. And I kind of want to get into a little bit of a detail about this, because this is what the article in the Willamette Week was even about. So back in those days, the state boxing and wrestling commissions put out the wrestling licenses. And in some states, like in Texas or Louisiana or whatever, they would only give out one license per state. This is how Bill Watts was able to keep the license in Louisiana, and certain other promoters in the NWA was able to keep out competition, is that they would get a license and then they would prevent their competition from getting a license. In this situation, Oregon, Don Owen already had that license. He had been the promoter there pretty much forever. And eventually, Billy Jack Haynes ended up getting his own wrestling license in March of 1988. He brings in a man named Irwin Kaplan, who was the financier of this venture. Now, he wasn't quite the financier, but he was sort of the middleman. He was the guy that the investors believed in. They may not have had any trust in Billy Jack Haynes as a owner of the company, but Irwin Kaplan was the advertising manager for the Daily Journal of Commerce. So a lot of investors really sort of trusted him. And the OWF, the Oregon Wrestling Federation, it ended up being a very interesting case, because one of the things that Billy Jack Haynes did is he actually targeted Don Owen, who was the guy who gave him his chance. First, he mentioned that most of the promoters had never wrestled before, which I'm not even sure is the case with Don Owen. I'm not that familiar with his history. I'm pretty sure he was a wrestler of some kind. But he would attack the wrestlers that worked for Don Owens, calling them fat, out of shape, and poor performers. And in a way, he was out to take over Oregon. He had this vision of being the Vince McMahon of Oregon. That was sort of what they said in Dark Side of the Ring. The plan was to run 6 days a week in high school gyms and National Guard armories all over the state. They had television on Channel 44, KPDX, and he was making pretty big guarantees to the boys. Now, in the Wrestling Observer newsletter, it said that Billy Jack Haynes was making guarantees of $600 to $800 a week. To performers that were pretty green with very little experience. Though we do know that quite a few of Billy Jack Haynes' friends actually joined the OWF. One of them was Rip Oliver. Another was like Coco Samoa. There were some people with some names that was there. One of these names was Kevin Kelly. He was pretty green at the time. And Kevin Kelly is an important name because he will become Nails in the WWF later and have his own issues with Vince McMahon. At this point, the promotion had not even fully started yet. So we're still in March of 88. In April of 88, things become a little bit more difficult. I'm just going to read it directly from the article. I was unwilling to involve investors, Kaplan says, without the assurance that I would be able to protect their money. Kaplan asked for a contract. Haynes refused. Long before Haynes' first wrestling show ever took place, Kaplan bailed out, taking, by his estimate, more than $100,000 worth of potential investors with him. So the shows are pretty much dead from that point forward. Billy Jack Haynes asked the boys to take a 50% pay cut because now he can't pay them. The investors are gone. The boys agreed because the money, even if it was cut in half, was still more than they were making elsewhere. So on May 7th, 1988, the Oregon Wrestling Federation has its first show. 1,800 people would appear on to see the very first card, but only 550 would show up for the second card. Without advertising, the boys had to advertise the show themselves. They would go out on the street corners and pass out flyers, and they were not being paid to do this, however. And he was supposed to be paying for their transportation, and they ended up transporting themselves. around Oregon. With less money coming in, Billy Jack Haynes cut his own dates. He started only working the Saturday shows. After that point, Oregon Wrestling Federation went from 6 days a week down to 2, down to only Saturdays. At this point, the Haynes family is in debt. They're being threatened to be sued. Bankruptcy is looming, and the Oregon State Boxing and Wrestling Commission shuts down the OWF in July of 1988. At this point, he's essentially bankrupt and only 36 years old. Billy Jack Haynes had failed. The Wrestling Observer newsletter says that he was running Vince McMahon's, quote, bigger is better philosophy and ran out of money. But he never really had a financier in the first place. So it was very difficult times, and people should realize this. It's hard to run a business, man. So when everybody starts talking about how much people should be paid and what should be, you don't know what the profit margins are. You need to actually learn the internals of running a business. Billy Jack Haynes was pretty cocky. And when he started this venture, claiming that he was going to be the first ever wrestler promoter. And to him, this was a really great idea. He planned to have 14 to 16 wrestlers on the roster at one time and have an anti-drug message and all these things that he had planned to do. And all of it went up in smoke because mostly he just couldn't find the money. Outside money didn't want anything to do with him. They didn't trust him as a promoter. And to be quite honest, he wouldn't sign a contract with Irwin Kaplan, and that was the problem. They couldn't protect the money of the investors. I mean, the investors make things go round. They make things happen. So even though he was popular and a celebrity in the area, it wasn't enough. Of course, he continues to wrestle. He even goes back to wrestling for Don Owen after this. He was forgiven for running opposition. But his career was mostly quiet at this point. In Dark Side of the Ring, they skipped from him losing his job in the WWF to all of the insane stories that were told over time. Things such as him being a drug dealer, him being involved with the young men who were killed and laid down on the train tracks, believing that he was the son of Vince McMahon Sr., that he was drug dealing for the Clintons, various conspiracy theories. There was even some other things that were even left out of this, such as Billy Jack Haynes suing the WWF for $5 million, claiming that he had gotten hepatitis C from a wrestling match. The WWF basically rejected this and said that, hey, he had been wrestling before he came here. If he's got hep C, there's no proof that he got it working here. He also sued the WWF again in the CTE lawsuit. Of course, that was thrown out. And then in 2015, he challenged Stone Cold Steve Austin to a shoot fight. Stone Cold Steve Austin was married to Jeannie Clark, who wrestled, of course, well, not wrestled, but she was a manager. She went by the name of Lady Blossom. At one point in time, she was also married to Billy Jack Haynes. She also has a child with gentleman Chris Adams, and she has 2 children with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Once it became a little bit more public that Steve Austin was arrested for domestic violence, which I believe was directed mostly towards Deborah, who was Steve Austin's second wife. I'm not sure if he abused Jeannie or not. Not the point. The point is Billy Jack Haynes wanted to fight him for being a domestic abuser, and of course he was ignored. He blamed the WWF for the deaths of Roddy Piper, and it just had a lot going on. He had claimed that Vince McMahon tried to kill him. There was all sorts of insane stories that came out of this. Dark Side of the Ring tried to cover as many of these as possible. To me, it's impossible to follow all this stuff. You be grasping at straws for hours and hours and hours. His friends and family are calling him basically a manipulator. Rip Oliver's son talked about how Rep Oliver and Billy Jack Haynes conspired to defraud the Cauliflower Alley Club, which is absolutely disgusting because it's the closest thing to a union, I guess you could say, that wrestlers got in terms of taking care of them when they get older. And these guys had pretty much ran this operation on these guys, and he was, of course, went to live with Rep Oliver and was basically taking advantage of him, stealing his pills and medications and such. And Billy Jack Haynes is seen mostly as kind of a crazy old man, but he's got a seedy background. Like, he'd been to prison, he was a bully, he was a drug addict who often, had not only overdosed and cost himself a job in the WWF, but he was regularly involved with shady figures. He had been beat up by some organized crime figures. In Dark Side of the Ring, they even sort of suggested that organized crime was behind the Oregon Wrestling Federation. I haven't been able to verify that. Again, I mentioned the name of the businessman who was going to help finance the Oregon Wrestling Federation, but he pulled out, a couple of weeks before the first show. So there's just so many stories floating about. Obviously, the big issue, of course, is the second-degree murder story, where apparently he murdered his wife, who was 85 years old. They met when she was in her earlier 80s, and he would have been in his mid-60s around that time. And he claimed that it was a mercy killing due to how bad her dementia had gotten. It's impossible to know what's true and what's not. Billy Jack Haynes himself believes he was overcharged, which, we never know. If there is some kind of insurance issue here, that could be the case, but that has not been said yet. But that's the only other option there, is that he tried to cash in on some kind of insurance thing. But why would you shoot her in the head if you're trying to cash in on the insurance, right? Because you're a 70-year-old man. You didn't think you were going to get away with that, did you? But the entire story of Billy Jack Haynes is all about him being this physically gifted individual who was brought into pro wrestling because he had a perfect look for it. He fit the audience and the demographic that they wanted. He was given a tremendous amount of success and a whole lot of opportunities, and he squandered it to do drugs and being essentially an eccentric, crazy old dude. It's almost the exact same story as Tony Atlas. Both were bodybuilders. Both got into wrestling. Both were pretty green. Both had a very limited amount of success and pretty much peaked in the 80s. Both are known for telling tall tales. Of course, Tony Atlas is way out there in comparison to Billy Jack Haynes. Billy Jack Haynes is next level when it comes to making up shit. He's almost Hulk Hogan level. Like, the idea that he was a drug dealer for the Clintons is crazier than Hulk Hogan thinking that he was going to be the guitarist for Metallica. That's more believable than that Billy Jack Haynes was, running dope for the Clintons. It's just not believable, right? Even somebody who hates the Clintons wouldn't come up with anything like that. He even said that Vince McMahon tried to have him killed, which is psychotic. He said that he was the real son of Vince McMahon Sr., which is absolutely absurd. There's so many things that have come out of this guy's mouth that is not even rooted in reality. So if you try to put him on the list of wrestling's biggest liars, he's a bigger liar than even Hulk Hogan is. So it's impossible to trace through all this stuff. But it was a very good episode of Dark Side of the Ring because there's not much there to work with Billy Jack Haynes, because you have to follow all of these crazy conspiracies, and every few years him popping up saying that the WWF gave him hepatitis, or he wants to fight Stone Cold Steve Austin, or he's going to sue somebody for this, or he's drug dealing for this guy, or whatever the case may be. And he very well may have been a drug dealer, but on the scale that he's talking about is not likely. So it was a good episode of Dark Side of the Ring, but I really don't like the subject because there's not a lot there. It's so much mythology and bullshit. smoke and mirrors when it comes to Billy Jack Haynes, that it's impossible to keep up with this stuff. But what do you think? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.
No one does it better.